All right, hi everybody. Hopefully you're doing great out there and thanks for watching. In this video, I'm going to continue my discussion of Plato's Meno. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So we're making good progress in the Meno, uh, taking a bit of a methodical approach. So we've talked about Socrates' solution to Meno's paradox is found in Plato's text. And, you know, um, there's someone like Plato, he's interested in trying to explain big picture later in his philosophy, how it is that we can know certain truths which we know to be necessarily true, like mathematical truths. So truths like 7 plus 3 equals 10, or the truth that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared when we run the Pythagorean theorem, and a whole host of others, mathematical truths, which seem to be the domain of necessary truths, truths that just don't happen to be true, but are true in such a way that they couldn't have been false. So we call truths that could have been false contingent truths, meaning that they happen to be true, but they could have been false. So, it might just happen to be true that, you know, um, the that you're a student here at Cal Poly. You could have been a Gaucho, you could have went to UCSB, you could have went to some other university. Um, we think that some of the some of what science discovers is not necessary. We think that, you know, um, the some of the laws could have been other than what they in fact are. Perhaps the speed of light could have been a bit faster, maybe it could have been a bit slower, right? There's debates on these things, but I'm just trying to give you like a sampling of the kinds of things that we seem to consider as contingent. They're true, but they didn't have to be true. Um, Mathematical truths, for example, seem to be different in the sense that when we think about 7 plus 3, it couldn't have been but 10. It couldn't have been 9. It couldn't have been 11. It couldn't have been any other number. 7 plus 3, right? Just given what 7 is, given what 3 is, and given the plus function, it has to be 10. And someone like Plato, perhaps Socrates, but as far as we know, Plato was interested in giving a theory of knowledge that could accommodate necessary truths. And perhaps this theory of recollection is one that can guide us. We remember these necessary truths from our eternal past, our infinite past, or something like that. Um, I'm just trying to, in a way, give some justification for why Socrates in Plato's Meno goes for such heavy duty claims, metaphysical claims about what we essentially are, nature, and also about how what we know and how we know by way of this kind of remembering truths from our past life. Okay, so that was just to say a bit more about this Socrates' solution to Meno's paradox as found in Plato's Meno. That's a theoretical solution. But then there's also a practical solution, one that involves thinking about, like what's significant about having a solution as it pertains to living our lives and seeking what's true. And in the text, Socrates says we'll be less idle and less faint-hearted if we think that there's a solution to Meno's paradox, if we think that his solution is correct for that matter, even though he's clear that he is just sketching a solution, it's a partial solution to deal with Meno's paradox. So we'll be less lazy, we'll be less, might say cowardly, um, less inclined to just living a lazy life if we think that there is a solution to Meno's paradox. If we're not beginning our inquiries by with a thought that there's no way of discovering anything. Okay, so Socrates thinks that there's sort of this practical advantage to his solution to Meno's paradox. Okay, how does Socrates attempt to defend his solution to Meno's paradox? Well, um, he does so, I think, in terms of its theoretical, in terms of the theoretical solution and the practical solution, in terms of a conversation. And I'm going to put practical here and practical, just so we're clear here. So I think that what we're going to see is the theoretical solution supported, but then there's going to be some support for the practical as well. So Socrates, he converses with Meno's slave about geometry of all things. And let me see if I can just give you the long and short of it. It's there's a lot going on in the example, but I've got well, here's the here's where in the text that the discussion begins. On top page 72, Socrates again calls Meno a rascal, and then goes on to discuss mathematics with Meno's slave, who has no formal education. Still, here's what happens. Let's see if I can bring this down and open. There we open this. So you can see that okay. Yeah. So we have, here's figure 0. We have a square, work with me, whose area is 1 foot squared. And what does x have to be in terms of feet? So what does the length of x have to be? In this case, well, x has to be 1 feet, or 1 foot, excuse me. So Socrates, if you read the text, and hopefully you did, he really leads Meno to the right answer in this case. The language that Socrates uses is complicated, not the kind of language that we use nowadays when talking about such examples. So my discussion here is a reconstruction of a part of the conversation that Socrates has with Meno's slave. Suppose we have a square whose area is 4 foot squared. Well, then x would have to be 2 feet in this case. When you think about, again, what would the length of x have to be in terms of feet? Okay. But then we get to this case. Meno's slave does very well with respect to the first 2 cases, and in fact is really confident about X in this third case because of his ability to answer so well in these first 2 cases. So when we get to this third case, when we have a square whose area is 8 foot squared, he thinks all we have to do is double the side here, double the side of the second square. So then this would be 4 feet. But of course, if this is 4 feet, then you're going to end up with a square whose area is not 8 foot squared, but 16 feet squared. So not 8 feet squared, but 16 feet squared. So x here would have to be something like, the square root of 8, square root of 8 feet, and then you just punch that in your calculator and you get your easy answer. Now, of course, Meno, Socrates, they don't have access to calculators in this kind of way, but they could theoretically work out the answer here. But the slave, no formal education, struggles with this case. So in the first instance, the state that the slave is in, the epistemic state that the slave is in, is one of confidence. You might say overconfidence about what x is when coming to this the case of this third square. Why is he overconfident? Because he did so well with the first 2 cases, but he still doesn't know what x is, so he has this overconfidence about what x is. Okay, but doesn't know it. So, part of what explains overconfidence is the fact that he doesn't know it, but he thinks he does. I mean, he's quite certain he knows what it is, but he doesn't know what it is. And then Socrates shows him that he doesn't know what it is. He says you can't just double the result from the second example. I put 4 feet here. You can't do that. So now the slave is like, okay, I don't know. So he loses his overconfidence and is humbled. So the initial epistemic state that the slave is in is one of overconfidence. You might even say some form of arrogance about what he thinks he knows, about what he thinks he knows. But then, as a result of Socrates using the Socratic method on him, he gets the slave to realize that he doesn't have knowledge of X in this case. So he's humbled. He's epistemically humbled. So he goes from epistemic overconfidence, epistemic humility. Not that he's humiliated, because nothing vicious happens here, as it turns out. It's just that Meno slave is brought to a state where he is humbled. And that's not vicious in its own right. Being humbled seems like it's a good thing. We would call it virtuous to be humbled. So then we have, the partial support, don't we, for the theory of recollection, in that the slave, Meno slave, has some knowledge about some mathematical knowledge in these cases. But then what's happening in this third case is, well, something more is happening than just a defense of the the theory of recollection. What's also going on is that Socrates is showing that, look, when we use my method that I've been using over and over again, the Socratic method, we see that there's a kind of humility that occurs when you use that method properly, and that happens in this case. So, um, and then also when you look at the text, even, so let's go to the text. Um, we see on page 75. Yeah, right here, 76, 70, yeah, 75. I was right. He says, you realize, Meno, what point he has reached in his recollection, talking about Meno's slave. At first, he did not know what the basic line of the 8-foot square was. Even now, he does not yet know. But then he thought he knew and answered confidently as if he did know and did not think himself at a loss. But now he does think himself at a loss, and as he does not know, neither does he think he knows. Okay, but that's just capturing the idea that he moves from a state of being um, epistemically overconfident to a state of being epistemically humbled. And he says that's true. He says so now he's in a better position with regard to the matter he does not know. And Meno says, yeah, I agree with that. Have we done him any harm by making him perplexed and numb as a torpedo fish does? Excuse me. He says, I don't think so. So now this is interesting, right? Because remember the discussion of the perplexed and numb torpedo fish. When we go back to our slides here and come back to this, remember, Meno gets upset because Socrates has shown him, it seems, that he doesn't know what virtue is, the essence of virtue is. Meno then goes off on Socrates, remember, right? Gets really angry with him, calls him a broad torpedo fish, remember? So Meno, as we agreed there, is claiming that he's been epistemically hurt by Socrates, as opposed to epistemically benefited, you might say. But look, Socrates has done the very same thing to Meno's slave, and Meno just agreed that there was no epistemic hurt here. It was actually something that did epistemically harm the slave. It actually, as we're going to see, benefited. But if that's true, then Meno should be able to reason. We don't know if he does or not, but he's at least in a position to do so. He should be able to reason that, well, what just happened to the slave happened to me previous, where Socrates used his method, the method of the Socratic method, to, remember, bewitch and beguile and numb Meno's mind and tongue. And, well, it looks like Meno wants to say that was a kind of harm, but the method actually did something that didn't harm. It actually benefited, as we're going to see, it improved. So let's go back to this slide here, go back to the text, and we see here. Um, Indeed, we have probably achieved something relevant to find out how matters stand. For now, as he does not know, he would be glad to find out. Whereas before, he thought he could easily make many fine speeches. Remember Meno talking about giving many fine speeches about the essence of virtue? The large audiences about the square of double size, and said that it must have a base twice as long. Maybe Meno wasn't giving speeches about the essence of virtue, but he was giving speeches about virtue. I think Socrates in part teaches Meno about this idea about the essence of virtue, and then, well, they're off to the races and trying to find a definition. But in any case, Meno thought he was giving definitions, or thought he was giving speeches about virtue, and thought he knew quite a bit about it. And Meno says, so it seems, do you think that before you have tried to find out that what you thought he knew, he did not, before he fell into perplexity and realized he did not know and longed to know? So I don't think so, Socrates. So then he has benefited from being numbed. And Meno says, I think so. So this then is an occasion for Meno once again to reflect. Well, maybe I've been benefited. Not only have I not been harmed, I've actually been benefited. I've been improved. I've been in some sense made better, just as the slave was. So the slave has been made better. He's been improved epistemically. How's he been improved? Well, he's been humbled. He's been humbled. He's lost his overconfidence, and now is in a position to try to find out what X is in this third case. So now the slave's in a position to find out what X is, just like Meno, after the Socratic method is applied to him and his discussions with Socrates on the nature of virtue, is now in a better position. Epistemically, he's humbled to then try to find out what virtue is. So even though it may have hurt in some sense, the hurt wasn't a harm, and in fact, it was a benefit because it puts him in a position to try to find out what virtue is, just like slaves now in a position to find out what X is. And there's kind of a practical argument here, isn't there? Like, look, practically speaking, slaves going to be willing to go out and try to find out what it is, seek the education necessary to find out what X is. just like, guess what? Just like Meno's not in a position to practically try to find out what the essence of virtue is. So we find quite a bit going on in that example. So some conclusions of the slave example. There's some initial support for the recollection method, both theoretical and practical, and theories provided. So the method, there's support for the method and theory that's provided. And recollection seems to usher in a new method for doing philosophy. So we go beyond just the Socratic method, whose aim is to humble, and recollection, his aim is to guide us in trying to move beyond being humble to try to find answers once we're humbled to the philosophical questions, okay, or mathematical questions, or whatever they turn out to be, whatever we're inquiring into. And the true aim of the Socratic method is highlighted. It's humility. It's to be humbled, such that we can then move past our arrogantly held beliefs or our overconfidently held beliefs to try to find out what's really true, not what we think is true. I think the reader here is invited to reflect on their life and what they believe, and what they may even strongly believe, to see whether they're just thinking they believe something or they really do so. And the limits of the Socratic method are highlighted in some sense. Well, why do we need a recollection method if the Socratic method would be enough? Since the Socratic method, I think Plato is saying here, through Socrates, it gets us only so far. It gets us humble and it puts us in a position then to try to answer the questions we're seeking, including the philosophical answers we're seeking. So we get this theory of recollection that's supplemented to the Socratic method to guide us here. And I think Plato is exploring alternative methods for doing philosophy in addition to what his master taught him, the Socratic method. Okay, so at this point in the dialogue, we move on to a new question. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I think I've said enough for now. Try to keep these videos bite-sized as much as I can. So I'll talk about the last part of the Meno in the next video coming up. So thanks for watching, and be well.